What if a city was bombarded not because of war, not because of rebellion, but simply because of money? This is the story of Alexandria, Egypt, and one of the most shocking moments in modern history when powerful nations used military force not to win territory or crush enemies, but to protect their investments. In 1882, the British Navy opened fire on this ancient Mediterranean port. Thousands of people fled, buildings burned, trade collapsed. But the official story told to the world was about protecting European lives and restoring order. Behind the smoke and cannons, however, was something far less noble. There was a massive financial crisis, desperate foreign investors, and one country drowning in debt so deep that it seemed impossible to climb out. The real question that historians still debate today is simple but uncomfortable. Did Britain bombard Alexandria to restore peace, or did they do it to protect their money? To understand why this happened, we need to go back decades, to a time when Egypt was not a weak nation but an ambitious one. We need to travel back to the mid-1800s, to a period when Egypt was trying to transform itself into a modern global power. This was a country with dreams, big dreams. Egypt wanted to build railways that would connect distant cities. They wanted to expand ports so that ships from across the world could dock and trade. They wanted to open factories in the desert and build new cities where only sand had existed before. The man leading this incredible transformation was Isma'il Pasha, the ruler of Egypt. He had a vision of turning his country into a European-style empire, with modern technology and infrastructure that would rival the great powers of Europe. But there was one problem with this dream. Modernization was expensive. It was very expensive. Building railways required tons of materials and workers. Expanding ports meant dredging channels and constructing docks. Opening factories meant buying machines and equipment. Creating new cities meant housing, roads, and electricity. The cost was astronomical, so where did Egypt get the money for all of this? They turned to the one place that always seemed to have endless capital. They turned to European banks. French and British financiers eagerly offered to lend money to Egypt. They offered bonds and loans, tens of millions of pounds sterling, all backed by confidence that Egypt's trade would increase and the country would repay everything. At first, the plan seemed brilliant. Trade did boom. Foreign investors celebrated as their investments grew. And Egypt really did become the gateway between Europe and Asia, especially after the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869. This canal was revolutionary. It meant that ships no longer had to sail all the way around Africa to reach Asia. They could pass through Egypt instead, cutting weeks off their journeys. For Britain, this was especially important because they had enormous trade with India and needed fast routes. Egypt seemed positioned to become incredibly wealthy. But there was one critical problem with this entire system. It was built on borrowed money. Borrowed money is not the same as real wealth. You can borrow and build, yes, but eventually you have to repay what you borrowed. By the 1870s, Egypt owed European creditors over £100 million sterling. This was an astronomical sum at that time. To give you perspective, this was equivalent to several years of Egypt's entire national income. And it was not just the loan itself that was the problem. Interest payments alone consumed most of the government's revenue. Every single pound that Egypt earned through trade or taxes had to go to paying interest to European banks. The country was no longer just modernizing, it was drowning in debt. This is when the real power struggle began, and this is where the story becomes darker. Imagine a country like a household with too many credit cards. Picture loans on top of loans, interest piling up month after month, year after year. Picture creditors standing at your door demanding repayment. That was Egypt in the late 1870s. European investors, especially from the United Kingdom and France, had poured enormous capital into Egyptian bonds. These bonds were like IOUs. The Egyptian leaders had promised investors that they would pay them back with interest. But suddenly, Egypt could no longer keep that promise. The money simply was not there. In 1876, the Egyptian government effectively went bankrupt. When countries default on their debts, when they cannot pay back what they borrowed, creditors rarely just walk away and accept their losses. Instead, something extraordinary happened. Britain and France took control of Egypt's finances. They took physical control. This system became known as the dual control, and it was a shocking arrangement. European officials were placed directly inside Egypt's government. These foreign officials had real power. They controlled how much money the government could collect through taxation. They supervised how the government spent that money. And most importantly, they made sure that debt payments to European investors came first, before everything else. Not infrastructure projects, not social programs. Not even the Egyptian military, just debt, just payments to foreign bondholders. To many Egyptians, this looked less like financial assistance from friendly nations and more like financial colonization. They saw foreign officials dictating their national priorities. They saw money that belonged to Egypt being sent to Europe instead of being used to improve their own country. Resentment began to spread through the army, the government, and the streets. Ordinary people were angry, army officers were humiliated. Government officials felt powerless, and soon, a nationalist movement would emerge to challenge this entire system. This movement needed a leader, and it found one. That man was Ahmed Urabi. He was a colonel in the Egyptian army, but he became much more than that. He became the voice of a growing nationalist revolt against foreign control. Urabi believed something that seems obvious to us today but was revolutionary at the time. Egypt should be ruled by Egyptians. Not by foreign bankers, not by European investors. Not by a system designed to benefit people thousands of miles away in London or Paris. In 1881, Urabi's movement forced political reforms. They demanded an end to European control over the country's finances. They wanted Egypt to be free to make its own decisions. To many ordinary Egyptians, this was liberation. This was hope, but to foreign investors, it was absolutely terrifying. These investors saw their profits disappearing. They saw their bonds becoming worthless. Because if Urabi succeeded in his revolution, Egypt might cancel its debts or restructure them. Egypt might say to Europe, "We cannot pay." The investors might lose millions of pounds overnight. Their panic spread across European financial markets like wildfire. Stock prices dropped. Investors sold their holdings in panic. The stakes were enormous, and they were not just financial stakes, they were strategic too. The United Kingdom depended heavily on the Suez Canal for trade with India and Asia. Britain had massive interests in the region. And now British investors feared losing both their money and their influence, so Britain made a decision. It sent warships to Egypt. Officially, Britain claimed it was not there to invade, it was there to protect. But the arrival of warships does not calm tensions, it escalates them. The presence of British guns in Alexandria's harbor made Egyptians angry. It felt like a threat, it looked like a threat. And tensions quickly escalated into something much worse. Riots broke out in Alexandria. Foreign residents fled the city. British commanders looked at the Egyptian coastal defenses and claimed they threatened their fleet. Maybe they did, or maybe that was an excuse. Either way, Britain issued an ultimatum. "Dismantle your coastal defenses," Britain said to Egypt. "Dismantle them, or we will fire on you." This was not a polite request. This was a threat. Egypt refused. The leaders of Egypt understood what was happening. They understood that Britain wanted to maintain control over their country's finances. They understood that Britain was willing to use military force to protect its investments. So on July 11, 1882, Egypt refused to obey the British demand. And for nearly 10 hours, British warships fired relentlessly into Alexandria. It was not a quick attack, it was sustained bombardment. For hour after hour, guns roared, the city shook. Entire neighborhoods were destroyed. Warehouses burst into flames. Thousands of civilians fled the city, carrying whatever they could. One of the Mediterranean's most important trading ports was reduced to chaos and rubble. Ships were sunk, infrastructure was destroyed. Trade collapsed, but the bombardment was only the beginning of what was to come. Within weeks of the bombardment, Britain launched a full military invasion of Egypt. This was no longer about protecting citizens or defending against threats. This was an invasion. British soldiers marched across Egyptian territory. Urabi's nationalist forces tried to resist, but they were defeated at the Battle of Tel El-Kebir in September 1882. The British military was more advanced, better organized, and better supplied. It was not a fair fight. Urabi's forces lost. And just like that, Egypt fell under British occupation. This is the crucial moment in the story. Britain officially said the occupation would be temporary. Just a short-term measure to restore order, they said. To stabilize the government, to protect investments, just temporary. In reality, British forces occupied Egypt for over 70 years. 70 years. Multiple generations of Egyptians lived their entire lives under British occupation. But here is the key detail that most people miss when they study this history. The occupation stabilized something very specific. It did not stabilize democracy. It did not protect Egyptian independence or Egyptian freedom. But it did stabilize Egypt's debt payments. European bondholders were protected. Their investments were safe. Financial markets in London and Paris calmed. Investors felt confident again. The global flow of capital continued. The system continued. In other words, the cannons of Alexandria did not just defend an empire. They defended investments. They protected money. They ensured that foreign investors would get paid, even if it meant occupying a country for 7 decades. This story from the 1880s reveals something powerful about how global finance works. It shows us that debt can shape politics. It demonstrates that debt can control governments. And sometimes, debt can even start wars. Throughout history, powerful nations have often stepped in when their investments were threatened. They have used gunboat diplomacy, which means using military force to support economic interests. They have imposed financial control over weaker nations. They have used economic intervention to protect their money. Different names, same strategy. The pattern did not stop in the 1800s. The pattern continues. Today, international lenders like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank still influence national economies through loans and financial programs. Modern governments still struggle with debt. Modern investors still have power over national governments. The methods are different now. Ships with guns no longer blockade ports. Instead, financial advisors from wealthy nations tell poor nations how to run their economies. But the underlying principle remains familiar. When money crosses borders, so does power. Someone in one country controls what happens in another country, not through military force alone, but through financial control. Which raises an uncomfortable question that we should all think about. When governments intervene overseas, when they send military forces to other nations, are they protecting people? Are they protecting human rights? Are they protecting peace, or are they protecting capital? Are they protecting their money? Because the cannons that fired on Alexandria might tell us something important about the world we still live in today. Look around. Poor nations often struggle with enormous debts to wealthy nations and international organizations. Rich nations often have influence over poor nations because of loans. Governments sometimes make decisions based on what foreign investors want, not what their own people want. Trade agreements often benefit wealthy nations more than poor nations. This pattern has not disappeared. It has just changed form. The battleships are gone, but the financial pressure remains. The military occupation is gone, but the economic control persists. This is why the story of Alexandria matters. It is not just history. It is a lens through which we can understand the modern world. It shows us that conflicts are often about money, even when they are dressed up in noble language about peace and protection. It shows us that military force is often used to protect economic interests, not just to prevent wars or protect people. It shows us that smaller nations with debts are vulnerable to larger nations with capital. And it shows us that this pattern has deep historical roots. It did not start in 1882, and it did not end in 1952 when Britain finally left Egypt. The bombardment of Alexandria was not just a military event. It was a financial event. It was a moment when debt, investors, and global power collided with explosive force. It was a moment when a country tried to break free from financial control, and the nations holding that country's debts used military force to maintain their grip. It was a moment that shaped the next 70 years of Egyptian history. It was a moment that demonstrated the power of money and the willingness of wealthy nations to use military force to protect their investments. Think about this story the next time you hear about military interventions in other countries. Think about who benefits. Think about whether the stated reasons match the real reasons. Think about the role of money and investment. Because sometimes the biggest battles in history are not fought over land or ideology or religion. Sometimes the biggest battles are fought over debt. Sometimes wars are not about glory or conquest or principle. Sometimes wars are about money. The story of Alexandria shows us this truth in stark and bloody clarity. It shows us that when we understand the financial forces behind historical events, we understand history better. We understand the world better, and maybe, just maybe, we can make better decisions in the future. The cannons that fired on Alexandria in 1880 fired for investment. They fired for debt payments. They fired to protect a financial system that benefited Europe at the expense of Egypt. And that same system, in different forms, continues today. Understanding this history helps us understand why the world works the way it does. It helps us see the connections between money, power, and military force. It helps us recognize patterns that repeat across centuries. And it reminds us that when we read the news, when we hear about interventions and conflicts, we should always ask ourselves, who benefits? What money is at stake? What investments are being protected? Because the answer to those questions often tells us the real story behind the official story. The real reasons behind the stated reasons. The financial truth behind the political words. This is why history matters, not just as stories about the past, but as tools for understanding the present and preparing for the future. The bombardment of Alexandria was devastating for the people who lived through it. It was tragic, it was destructive, but it was also instructive. It teaches us about power and money and how they work together. And that lesson is one we need to remember and understand as we navigate our modern world, where money still has tremendous power, and where debt still shapes the decisions of nations.